You know, people always ask me about the war. They want to hear about battles, about North Africa, about the day we surrendered. But that's not what changed me. What changed all of us, was a toilet. I know how that sounds, but let me tell you what happened when we arrived in Texas in the spring of 1943. It was mid-May, and Texas was hotter than anything we'd experienced, even in the African desert. The heat just sat on everything, heavy and thick. When our train pulled into that camp, we didn't know what to expect. We'd been told stories, you understand. Stories about American brutality, about how prisoners were treated. We expected suffering. We expected punishment. We'd surrendered in North Africa. We were the defeated enemy. But when we stepped off that train, something felt wrong. Or, maybe, right. I couldn't tell yet. There were guards, yes, with their rifles. But they weren't pointing them at us with hatred in their eyes. One of them was actually smiling. Actually smiling at us, like we were just, I don't know, like we were visitors, or something. He tipped his hat back and grinned in the sunshine. That smile frightened me more than any weapon. I'd been trained for brutality. I hadn't been trained for this. They marched us through the gates, and I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Where was the cruelty? Where was the revenge? The barracks were just wooden buildings. Simple, clean, organized. My friend Klaus, he was from a farm in Bavaria, he looked around and said, "This looks like the youth camp I went to when I was 12. We laughed, but it was nervous laughter. This didn't make sense. When they showed us inside, I couldn't believe it. There were beds, actual beds with mattresses. Cotton mattresses, and blankets folded neatly at the foot of each bunk. Windows with real glass panes. Back home, my grandmother's house still had wooden shutters. She'd never had glass windows in her entire life. There was a pitcher of water just sitting on a table. Clean water, just... One of the men whispered to me, "This is nicer than my school was." And that's when I started to feel it, this uncomfortable feeling in my chest. This cognitive dissonance. We were prisoners of war. We were supposed to be suffering. This was too clean, too comfortable, too human. Then they took us to the washroom. They'll never forget this moment. Never. "Oh, frozen I live." The guard opened the door, and this smell hit us, soap and disinfectant. But it wasn't unpleasant. It was clean. Aggressively clean. And then we saw them. Porcelain toilets. White, gleaming porcelain toilets lined up against the wall. And sinks. Chrome faucets that caught the electric light. We just stood there, frozen, staring. I'd grown up using an outhouse. You understand what that means? In winter, you'd go outside in the freezing cold to a wooden shack with a hole in a bench. In summer, the smell was unbearable. You shared it with your whole family, sometimes your neighbours, and you emptied it yourself, hauling the waste to the fields. That was normal. That was normal. That was life. But this was something from a dream. Franz, tall guy from Hamburg. He walked up slowly and touched it. Just ran his hand along the smooth porcelain like he was touching something sacred. Another man tapped the handle, like he wasn't sure it was real. The guard motioned for us to use it. To actually sit on it. The first man to try it sat down so carefully, like he thought it might break. Or explode. We all watched, holding our breath. And then he pulled the handle. The sound was incredible. Water rushed and swirled and everything just disappeared. Gone in seconds. The man jumped up like he'd been shocked. like he'd been shot. And we all started talking at once, crowding around, everyone wanting to see it, to try it for themselves. One man flushed it 3, 4, 5 times, just laughing in disbelief. Another went to the sink and turned the tap. Clean water, just poured out. He cupped his hands under it, drinking, splashing his face. We'd grown up carrying water in buckets from village wells. You treasured every drop. But here, water just flowed freely. Turn a handle, and there it was. The American guards just leaned against the wall, watching us with these amused expressions. I found out later that one of them wrote home to his wife. These German boys acted like we'd given them a chest of gold. Never seen grown men so excited about a bathroom. He wasn't wrong. That night, back in the barracks, we couldn't stop talking about it. We compared it to our homes, the frozen outhouses in winter, the chamber pots we'd empty each morning, the village pump where you'd wait in line. The village pump where you'd wait in line, the luxury of a weekly bath in a tin tub. And someone, I think it was Peter from Cologne, he said something that silenced all of us. If this is how they treat prisoners, how do the free people live? That question hung in the air. See, we'd been raised on propaganda. We'd been told that America was falling apart. Corrupt, weak, decadent. That's what they told us. That's what we believed, but we were prisoners, defeated enemies, and we had porcelain toilets that flushed with the pull of a handle. What did that mean? What did that mean? I lay awake that whole night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. The days developed a routine. And with each day, the contradictions became sharper. Breakfast in the mess hall, eggs, potatoes, sometimes bacon, real food. Substantial meals. We were eating 3,000 calories a day. That's what American soldiers got. Meanwhile, our families back home were surviving on thin soup and whatever vegetables they could grow. My wife was living on ration cards that barely provided enough. And here I was, a prisoner, eating better than I had in years. The guilt was crushing, but so was the gratitude. And I hated myself for feeling grateful. They had us do work, road repair, timber cutting, simple labour, and they paid us. In camp script, sure, but enough to buy tobacco, soap, little luxuries. Meanwhile, back in Germany, those same items were impossible to find. But it was always the bathroom facilities that haunted us. Every time I took a shower, hot water, just flowing from pipes, I thought about my younger brother, writing that he hadn't had a proper bath in months. Every time I washed my hands in a sink, I thought about my mother walking 2 miles to a hand pump, because ours had been destroyed in a bombing raid. One guy, Kurt from the Ruhr Valley, he admitted he'd bathed more in his first month as a prisoner than in his previous 2 years as a soldier. The camp even had a library. In the evenings, sometimes there was music. It was captivity, yes, but it was captivity wrapped in a strange kind of dignity. The letters from home made it worse. My wife described hiding in the cellar during air raids. My children were losing weight. She could see their ribs. The local school had been bombed. There was no glass to replace the windows, so they nailed up boards. I stood over a sink with running water, reading about her walking miles for a single bucket. I pulled a flush toilet handle, while she described using a bucket in the corner of their cellar. Another man, Johann, he'd been a true believer. Party member, proud soldier of the Reich. He used to give speeches about German superiority and destiny. One night he sat on his bunk and said to me, quietly, "They promised us glory, but we sit here as captives with more comfort than our families have as free people. What does that mean?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't have an answer. See? The Americans hadn't planned this as some kind of psychological warfare. They weren't trying to break us with kindness. This was just how they lived. This was normal for them. That's what made it so devastating. They weren't showing off. They weren't making a point. A point. Running water and flush toilets and regular hot showers. This was just basic infrastructure, standard, ordinary. And we'd been fighting for a regime that promised us we were superior, that we were building a 1,000-year empire, that we were the master race. But the master race didn't have flush toilets. The master race used outhouses and chamber pots. The master race left its civilians to starve while fighting a war. Meanwhile, the decadent Americans had built a society where even prisoners lived better than German civilians. Every flush of that toilet washed away another piece of what we'd believed. A man named Wolfgang said something I'll never forget. Their strength isn't in their tanks or planes. It's in how they live when they're not at war. That's real power. That's real power. The toilet became a joke among us. We'd laugh about it, make puns, call it the American throne, but underneath the humour was awe and fear and a growing understanding. Someone said, "They've conquered us with plumbing." It was meant as a joke, but it was true. Absolutely true. Absolutely true. The Reich had built its identity on military power, on discipline, on sacrifice. But it had left its people living in medieval conditions. The Führer talked about glory, while children went hungry and families lived without basic sanitation. America had simply built a society where ordinary people lived with dignity, with running water, with indoor plumbing, with enough to eat. And that was more powerful than any army. The guards, I think they understood this. They were kind to us. But it wasn't charity. But it wasn't charity. They knew that showing us how they lived was more effective than any punishment. They knew that every flush of a toilet, every hot shower, every full meal was an argument against everything we'd been told. They were right. When the war ended, and we finally went home, Germany was... It was rubble, just rubble. Cities flattened, infrastructure destroyed, people starving in the streets, and I carried with me the memory of Texas. The memory of hot showers, of full meals, and of toilets that flushed. I tried to tell people about it. Sure, the Americans have magic toilets. They didn't believe me. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew how the Americans lived. And I knew that we'd never really had a chance. Years later, my son asked me when I knew Germany would lose the war. I told him, "The day I flushed a toilet in Texas." He thought I was joking. I wasn't. See, we talk about wars being won by technology, by tactics, by bravery. And those things matter. They do. But we lost before we even started. We lost because we'd built an empire on speeches and violence and promises of glory, while the Americans had built a society on pipes and pumps and the quiet machinery of everyday life. We'd been told we were superior. But superiority isn't about slogans. It's about giving your people running water. It's about infrastructure. It's about making sure that ordinary life is dignified and comfortable. The flush toilet was just a symbol, but it was a powerful symbol, but represented everything we'd gotten wrong. Everything we'd gotten wrong. Everything we'd been lied to about. We'd fought for an empire that left us in filth and hunger. They'd built a nation that gave even its prisoners dignity. That's the story. That's what I learned in a POW camp in Texas in 1943. And every time I use a modern bathroom now, yes, we finally got indoor plumbing in our village in the 1960s. I think about it. I think about that first flush, that moment of revelation, the day everything I'd believed was washed away with the pull of a handle.